Hello all, my name is Ashutosh. I'm a teacher by profession. My mission is to impart quality education for all. For that purpose, I am creating these videos. If you appreciate my work, then please do like my video and subscribe my channel so that I could get the motivation to prepare more videos. Anyways, today in this particular lecture, we're going to discuss about your cellular capacity and various channel allocation mechanism. So these are the outlines. We're going to start up with the introduction where we will going to describe whatever we have studied in our last lecture. Then we're going to define cellular capacity and we'll try to get some mathematical formula for evaluating the same. Then we're going to discuss the various channel assignment strategies, that is how we will going to allocating frequency bands to the users in order to accomplish their communication. So there are basically two mechanisms, that is your fixed channel allocation and dynamic channel allocation. We're going to discuss them. Then finally we're going to conclude by discussing some of the advantages as well as disadvantages associated with your dynamic channel allocation. So in our last lecture we have discussed about the hexagonal cell structure and why it would have been considered as the standard for your cellular planning. Then we have also discussed about the spatial geometry of your hexagon, where we have discussed this axis transformation from UV axis to your XY axis, where we have basically discussed that this hexagonal geometry basically going to help us to evaluate or calculate the co-channel cell distances in terms of integral multiple of your cells. So now in this particular lecture, we are going to discuss about the cellular capacity, which is nothing but maximum number of calls supported by any communication system at any given time. And we will also discussing about various frequency band or channel allocation mechanism. So cell capacity. So as we have already discussed that cell capacity is nothing but it is the maximum number of calls supported by your any communication system per unit time. So this would have been called as your cellular capacity. So let us try to evaluate some analytical result to evaluate this cellular capacity. So here we are considering that a cellular system which will going to have this capital S number of full duplex channels. That is full duplex, we mean that we will be having bidirectional connectivity and we are in a state to transmit as well as receive our information signal simultaneously. So as this particular structure is basically showing that this is basically describing any cluster. This we have already discussed when we were studying about your frequency planning concepts. So this is basically showing a particular cell and this group of cell is basically being called as your cluster, where the specification is all these cells will going to possess different frequency component. Suppose any particular network provider have got any specific amount of spectrum, so it must have to plan out its complete cellular system with the help of that available spectrum only. So here in this particular scenario, we are assuming that your service provider has the spectrum of S duplex channel, that is your capital S number of calls might get supported. So now let us assume that each cell is allocated with K number of channels and each of these S channels are divided into N number of cells or clusters. Therefore, S is equal to K times of N. So what I am trying to say is, suppose this whole capacity is your total number of S full duplex channel is there and we have divided this particular capacity into N number of cell. So here in this particular example, this capital N value turns out to be your 7 and we have basically allocated this K number of channels to each and individual cell. That is, each and individual cell will going to contain this K number of channels per cell. So if we talk about the whole capacity of this cluster is, so S is equal to K times of N. So that is why we have written it over here. So S is equal to K times of N. So if the cluster of N cells is replicated M number of times in system, then the total number of full duplex channel C is equal to MKN. So suppose this particular cluster is basically covering a smaller geographical area only. In order to provide the cellular connectivity throughout the geographical area, we must have to replicate this particular cluster throughout the globe. This we have already discussed. So in this particular scenario, the capacity would have been given as C is equal to MKN, where this M is the multiplication factor or multiplying factor, that is how many times we have replicated this complete cluster over the geographical area in order to provide the coverage. So this K into N is nothing but it is your system capacity, that is this particular capacity can be represented in terms of S also. So that turns out to be M times of S, where M is your replicating factor and S is your cluster capacity. So this is the formal definition of your cellular capacity, that is C is equal to MKN. So if we are going to reduce the cluster size N, keeping the cell size fixed, more clusters are required to cover the entire geographical area. So what I wanted to tell you at this particular moment is, if you are going to reduce out the cluster size n, whereas you will going to keep the cell size fixed. So suppose if you're going to reduce the cluster size from 7 to 3 and we are keeping that cell size remain fixed. So obviously in order to cover up the entire geographical area, more number of times we have to replicate that particular cluster. So if we're going to perform replication more number of times, it means we will going to increase out our capacity, since replication factor m is having direct proportional relationship with your channel capacity. So if m will going to increase, that is if your replication factor will going to increase, then capacity will also going to increase. So we can easily say that if m will going to increase, our channel capacity will also going to increase, whereas this smaller n, that is smaller cluster size, will going to force us, that is co-channel cells will have to be designated at nearby places. So if this will be the case, then it will definitely going to increase your co-channel interference. So here this smaller n, it means your high capacity will be there, but it will come on the value of higher co-channel interference, which ultimately leads to the low quality of service. So if interference value will be higher, then in that particular case your signal quality will be inferior. That is why we have written that high co-channel interference will going to leads into low quality of service. So next point is your channel assignment strategies. That is how we will going to allocate our frequency ranges to our individual users, so their communication might have accomplished properly. So the main objective of your channel assignment strategies or frequency allocation strategy is to maximize the system capacity while minimize the interference. So obviously we must have to maximize our channel capacity, and side by side we also want to minimize the interference so that high quality of service to the end user might be provided. So this is your constraint optimization problem. That is, if you will going to minimize your co-channel interference, it means you will going to place co-channel cells at farther distances, which will basically going to lead into your low capacity. Whereas if you're going to increase the channel capacity, then in that particular situation you must have to put co-channel cells nearby, so which will definitely going to increase your co-channel interference. So it is basically a constraint optimization problem. That is, if you're going to increase one particular thing, second thing will also going to increase simultaneously. You are not in a state to maximize one thing and minimize other thing. So we must have to take a kind of trade-off between these two parameters. So this is your constraint optimization problem. So hopefully the objective of this frequency assignment would be clear to you. Now next is classification. That is how we will going to allocate our channel or frequency bands among the users. So here this particular figure is basically showing among different particular cells how you will going to allocating different frequency bands. So this is the basic insight of your channel allocation strategy or frequency assignment strategies. So there are two popular mechanisms. Number one is your fixed channel assignment and second one is your dynamic channel assignment. So we're going to discuss one by one. So first one is your fixed channel assignment. So as the name suggests, fixed channel assignment, that is fixed frequency allocation will be there. So each cell is assigned a predetermined set of voice channels. So here in this particular fixed channel assignment strategy, what we will going to do is we will going to allocate certain fixed frequency bands to individual cells. Then any request for a new call initialization beyond the free available channels will be blocked. So suppose in a particular cell we have allocated 10 frequency bands, that is 10 simultaneous calls might be supported by that particular cell only. As first, second, third or up to 10th request will going to enter into that particular cell, it will basically going to serve them. So as soon as 11th call initialization request come to that particular base station, then it will not going to serve this request, just because it doesn't have any frequency band to allocate for that 11th request. So that is why it has been mentioned that beyond the free available channels, calls will be blocked. So if all channels are busy, no request for handoff will be treated. So obviously if that particular base station will not going to have any free frequency band, then it will not in a state to serve any handoff request. So what option left for a user which is requesting for your handoff? That mobile station may have to wait or call even drop. So either that particular mobile station has to wait for some time, and in the meantime, if any ongoing call being ends up, then it might get the access, and if for a small duration of time that particular thing is not happen, then that handoff call might get even drop. So several solutions would have been presented for this particular problem. So number one is your borrowing strategy, which is saying that if a particular base station is having certain request of handoff, then either it must have to give the frequencies that are available to it, and if it is not available to him, then it will going to request certain channels to its neighboring base station who have free frequency bands. So this is basically called as your borrowing strategy. And second one is your reserve some channels for the handoff. Since we have to give an extra priority to our handoff calls, so just in order to serve them, what strategy we can follow them is we can reserve some of the channels over which we will only going to sustain some handoff calls only. Just as in the example we have discussed above, where we have provided 10 number of calls to individual cell. So suppose the criteria might be like for 7 number of call it will going to serve new call request, and 3 number of calls it will going to reserve for your handoff calls only. That is up to 7 new call initialization rate it will going to provide the services, and as soon as 8th new call initialization request comes into it, it will simply going to discard it just because it doesn't have any free frequency band and it has basically reserved 3 frequency channels for its handoff call only. So this particular criteria will basically going to reduce out the revenue. But as long as quality of service point of view, these schemes will going to get functional well, as base station will always having some free frequency bands for handoff call request. So next strategy is your dynamic channel assignment or dynamic channel allocation. So as the name suggests, dynamic channel allocation, that is on the runtime frequency band allocation will be there. So no permanent assignment of voice channel to any cell, as this is the case of your fixed channel assignment. We do not provide any permanent assignment to any of the voice channel to any of the base station. So any request for a new call initialization or handoff must be met by a dynamic channel allocation from a central pool of available channels by the MSC. So what we will basically going to do in this dynamic channel allocation is all the frequency channels would have been available with the MSC, and if anybody wants to have the access of those frequency channels, it must have to request directly to the MSC, and depending upon the requirement, MSC will going to give the access to a specific frequency channel to the base station. Whereas in your fixed channel allocation, we will basically imparting or giving fixed frequency channels to individual cells, and base station itself will going to take care of all the frequency allocation. But here your central entity MSC will going to take care for this frequency allocation. If we consider the case of your fixed channel allocation, it will basically going to works poorly. Just as our cellular traffic is very much dynamic, that is there might be the case that at certain moment individual cell will going to get more amount of traffic rather than other cells, or even some of the cells are there which may do not have any sort of traffic, but since we have already reserved those frequency bands for individual cells, then the cell who really needs that particular frequency band may not in a state to use them just because they are not accessible to it directly. So this is complete wastage of the resources. So dynamic channel allocation basically overcomes this sort of problems. So channel allocation is done by using an algorithm that takes into account. So now here these particular points will basically going to suggest us that is how dynamic channel allocation would have been performed. So the algorithm through which we will going to take the decisions or provide this frequency allocation mechanism must take into account these 3 points, that is the probability of future blocking in the cell, frequency of use of candidate channel, and reuse distance of the channel. So these above two points are certain statistical measure of the traffic inside a particular cell, that is a particular base station or cell. What is the probability that any individual frequency will going to get blocked or traffic request might have been placed on that particular frequency range only. Whereas frequency of use of candidate channel signifying any reserved frequencies that has been allocated to any specific user. So whether we are in a state to use them or not. Then third one is your reuse distance of the channel. So we also have to limit this co-channel interference. So this particular thing also taken into account that the particular frequency band that we are allocating to an individual user, its neighboring base station will not going to work on that particular frequency channel only. So now we're going to discuss the advantages as well as disadvantages of your dynamic channel allocation. So reduction of blocking probability. Since we are not at all allocating specific frequency bands to the base stations and we are basically allocating the frequency band on the demand basis, so this will definitely going to reduce out the blocking probability. Blocking probability is the probability that when a particular mobile station is demanding to generate its call and its request is not being served. So that probability is called as your blocking probability, and if we are using this dynamic channel allocation, it will definitely going to reduce out the blocking probability in contrast with your fixed channel allocation. So reduction of call drop probability during handoff. So this is also being clear, we had already discussed. Since in dynamic channel allocation, all the requests would have been served by your central entity MSC. So it is on demand basis. As long as complete communication system have got any vacant frequency, then that request would have been served by that MSC. So here in this particular scenario, we will not going to have this revenue loss. So improvement of system trunking capacity. So where trunking capacity would have been defined as your traffic intensity per channel. That is how maximum amount of information we can transport over the given frequency channels. So since in your dynamic channel allocation, we are using this on demand functionality, that is whenever there is a demand or need imposed by the mobile station, then only it would have been served by your MSC. So it will definitely going to increase your trunking capacity, or you could say spectral efficiency. So here idea is all channels must be accessible by all the cells. Since we have not provided any fixed reservation to any individual cell over the frequency ranges, so in this particular scenario, the strategy that is functional in this dynamic channel allocation is your all the frequency bands are basically accessible by all the channels depending upon their requirement. So all the above mentioned benefits are obtained at the cost of. So obviously we have seen that there is much advantages of your dynamic channel allocation, your fixed channel allocation. So but there has to be certain cost also that we have to pay. This is storage and the computational load on the MSC. Since here in this particular scenario, MSC is the central entity which will going to cater the request or demands of all the base stations. So if MSC have to deal with all those requests, then it must have to perform extensive computation. So MSC must collect real-time channel occupancy data. Since if this data is not holding by your MSC, then it is not in a state to make appropriate decisions. Traffic distribution information, this particular information must also being tracked by your MSC so that it can make appropriate decision. Specifically, we are talking about via this particular information only, it is in a state to get the idea about your future blocking probability. Then RSSI or your received signal strength indicators of all the channels so that it can facilitate proper handoff scenario. If it will not going to track out this RSSI or your received signal strength indicator, your handoff call might get dropped. So hopefully you guys have got the idea about cellular capacity as well as your channel assignment strategies. In case of any doubt, you can ask me in the comment section. I'll try to solve them out as soon as possible. So these are the references. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.